So, what the Indian Removal Act said was that the lands west of the Mississippi called Indian Territory would be preserved for these eastern tribes in perpetuity, and that the U.S. government would help facilitate the movement, would help pay for it, and also pay some of the value of the lands that the natives were giving up. It did not, though, force natives to move. There had to be some other kind of legal apparatus to force natives to move. So Jackson was willing to overlook anything to make that happen. So what was happening in Georgia was that Georgian settlers were increasingly settling closer and closer to Cherokee territory, and sometimes within Cherokee territory, and setting up their farms. The Cherokee would protest, and Georgia would say, our people had done nothing wrong. The goal was very much to try to displace them. What the Georgia government really wanted to happen was for fighting to break out. That way they could call it a security situation, get the federal government to send the army in, forcibly evict the Cherokee from their lands. So there were various ways that Georgia tried to accelerate this process, and they became even more covetous of Cherokee lands when gold was discovered in 1829. So what Georgia continued to argue was that Cherokee didn't actually have title to any of this land, and that Georgia did, according to the foundation documents of the colony and state, and that Cherokees living in Georgia were under Georgia jurisdiction. The Cherokees fought back against that legally. And there were two separate court cases that went to the Supreme Court, one of them called Cherokee Nation versus Georgia, the other called Worcester versus Georgia. So in Cherokee Nation versus Georgia, the court ruled that the Cherokee were an independent sovereign nation. They were not, though, a foreign nation. They were what he called a domestic dependent nation, which meant that they had autonomy, although they were under the legal aegis of the United States. And then they ruled in another court case, Worcester versus Georgia, that the laws of Georgia didn't count in Cherokee territory. So what Georgia tried to argue in Worcester versus Georgia, there was this guy named Samuel Worcester. He was a missionary, a white man, who was living among the Cherokee. And Georgia wrote a law saying that any white person who was living in Georgia had to give a loyalty oath to Georgia. And Worcester, he said he wasn't going to do that. Georgia arrested him, or the authorities arrested him, and the trial and ensuing case made it all the way up to the Supreme Court. What the court ruled on the case was that Georgia arrested him illegally because he was on Cherokee land, and Georgia's laws don't have force in Cherokee land. And so what the Chief Justice John Marshall wrote in his opinion that, quote, "The citizens of Georgia have no right to enter Cherokee Nation, and the laws of Georgia have no force in Cherokee Nation." Cherokee Nation deals with the United States government, not the Georgia government. That was the court decision. Andrew Jackson's reply was, okay, the court's made its decision, now let them enforce it. Jackson, as president, was not about to enforce the court's decision here. So the Cherokee politicians, or Cherokee leaders such as John Ross here, they had technically won an extraordinary victory. They couldn't have asked for a better legal decision in their favor to stay on their land than what the Supreme Court did. But they were still politically in a bad situation, even though legally they were right. Politically, they were in the wrong because Jackson didn't care about what the court decided, and neither did the state of Georgia. So what Georgia continued to do was encourage its settlers to harass the Cherokee, including putting together a militia in 1835, which invaded Cherokee territory, destroyed the Cherokee printing press that printed their main newspaper, saying that it was printing illegal propaganda against Georgia. And in other ways, just harassing the Cherokee in any way they could, bullying them, threatening them, and so forth. And the message was very clear. you need to leave. The Cherokee complained to the federal government, and Andrew Jackson's response was, if you left, none of this would be a problem. So there were some Cherokee who decided they could no longer put up with the abuse, and the best way to deal with this was to accept as much money as they could from the U.S. and move west. And one of the signatories to a treaty that did just that was John Ridge, who was a member of a prominent Cherokee family, and he signed what was called the Treaty of New Echota, which sold Cherokee land to the United States. It gave the U.S., I think, it gave Cherokee 3 years to voluntarily move, after which they would be forcibly removed or evicted by the U.S. Army. The Ridges were eventually assassinated for this, since they had signed this treaty against the will of the Cherokee Council. I'm going to have a link to a film on this, but I think one thing we want to remember about how terrible this was, the Cherokee were protected legally by the United States' own diplomacy and their laws and their interpretation of the laws through the Supreme Court. Then they were cheated out of what was right just because of the greed, essentially, of people who wanted that land. So the actual movement took place in, I think it was 1837 or 1838. Yeah, it was 1838. The removal began, and it was run by the natives themselves, but facilitated by the Army. The whole thing wasn't very well organized. They didn't plan well enough logistically. The winter was very bad when they were trying to travel through this territory. And so the journey was extremely damaging to a lot of people. We don't know exactly how many died, but most scholars agree that about 4,000 Cherokee died on the 1,500-mile journey from Georgia to Oklahoma. That's about 1 out of 4 people that started the journey. A big part of the problem was they hadn't planned for a rough winter, and so a lot of them froze to death and died of exposure and starvation during the bad winter, lack of medicine, and so forth. John Ridge paid the price. He and his father were assassinated about a year later by Cherokee who believed that they had wrongly sold out the nation and believed that justice needed to be served upon them. Another thing to remember about this, I always stress that this was not approved of by a majority of Americans. There were a lot of Americans that believed the Cherokee especially had done what they were supposed to do, and they were behaving according to the laws of the United States, according to the agreements the United States made, and those agreements have been affirmed by the Supreme Court. And so there were a lot of Americans who felt that the Cherokee were right, and unfortunately those people lost their political fight, and they lost it a lot closer than we give them credit for. The vote for Indian removal in the House of Representatives was very close. It was decided by only a handful of votes. Almost all the representatives in the North voted against it. The representatives in the South voted for it. And then the Treaty of New Echota itself, it only passed the Senate by 1 vote. And so the final apparatus to remove the legal apparatus to remove the natives, that was an extremely divisive political argument within the United States. The Cherokee had allies. They had quite powerful allies. Several of them were former high-level officials of the previous presidential administrations who argued on the Cherokees' behalf that they had been allies of the United States. So it was particularly tragic because of that, because what was a very close political fight ended up being so extremely destructive to the people those decisions affected. There were other natives who resisted removal aggressively. The Seminoles and the Seminoles fought back for a number of years. So the Black Hawk War started because some of the Sauk leaders believed that they should exercise their treaty rights. And so the treaty rights said, okay, if you move to the other side of the Mississippi, meaning they moved to Iowa from Illinois, but you can still come back to Illinois to hunt now and then. And so they tried to do that. The local settlers were freaked out. And so they started fighting the Sauks, and that caused what was called the Black Hawk War, called so because of Black Hawk, the Sauk war leader. And the Seminoles in Florida fought back in kind of a guerrilla resistance for a number of years against removal of their tribes to west of the Mississippi. And those wars were extremely difficult for the U.S. to prosecute. It took quite some time for the U.S. to root out all the Seminoles. Was very casualty intensive conflict. So in the end, removal did work for the most part. Natives who lived in the Old Northwest had been removed largely after the Tecumseh fighting, and a lot of these natives in the Southeast were removed legally via treaties and via the Indian Removal Act. What they had to deal with was now going to a whole new region, Indian Territory, and living there. They would face a number of new challenges there. Still had to fight to hold on to these new homelands against American settlers. Also had to deal with all the internal conflicts from a lot of tribes now being much closer to each other than they ever were.